Hello, good afternoon in San Diego and Ohio gozaimasu to Tokyo. It's November 16th, 2021, and this is the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego, and I'm also the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. We offer 7-degree programs, one of which is the Masters of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in more of our offerings, please visit gps.ucsd.edu. JFIT is our Japan Center. We conduct research, education, information, and connections across the Pacific. If you're interested to learn more about our Japan activities, we're at jfit.ucsd.edu. When you go there, you'll find a number of tabs, one of which is News and Media. Here you can sign up for our JFIT San Diego Japan Newsflash, where every other week we'll put together some news that you may or may not have seen in the standard news outlets. Right next to that tab is the Japan Zoominas tab. There you can find sign-up sheets for upcoming events, as well as recordings of our previous events. It looks like this. Our JZ gallery is divided into 4 components: business and economy, politics, society, and everything else. And if you go there, it looks like this, and you can click those buttons and listen to our past events. While I'm on my website, may I also alert you to our support button. Of course, UC San Diego is a nonprofit organization, and like every other place, we're short of cash. We would like to continue this event and hope that you might be willing to support us. If we were in person, we would of course have much more fun, but you would also incur some costs like driving here and parking and buying yourself a cup of coffee. It'd be wonderful if you could consider sharing those savings that you have through this Zoom setup with us by giving and supporting the Japan Zoomina at UC San Diego. Thank you very much. All right, so today we have, of course, 2 guests talking about energy and coal in particular. But let me alert you that in 2 weeks from now, November 30th, my guest will be Dr. Yuko Harayama, who used to be on the Council of Science and Technology at the Cabinet Office and now is the executive director of RIKEN. She will talk about the role of women in science, business, and politics in Japan, and she can tell a lot of war stories. So that'll be very interesting. Okay, with that, enough of me. Let me introduce my 2 guests. Our topic today is Asia's long exit from overseas coal financing. And here they are. We have with us Mr. Toshiyuki Sakamoto from IEEJ and Professor Michael Davidson from UCSD. So welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you. So let me introduce you. First, I'll introduce Sakamoto-san. He holds an MA in engineering from the University of Tokyo. He's a civil engineer, and also an MBA from the University of Michigan. Go Wolverines. He spent 30 years at he spent 30 years at METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, where he focused on energy and climate policies in Japan, but was also in various positions in charge of the paper industry, an energy intensive one, and also trade policy. Since 2020, he is a managing director of the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, or IEEJ, which is Japan's foremost think tank on all matters energy and climate. And as a managing director, he's in charge of climate change and energy efficiency matters. Thank you, Sakamoto-san. Take time out of your busy schedule and joining us today. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event. Thank you.
Thank you. And our second conversation partner today is Professor Michael Davidson. He is assistant professor at GPS and at mechanical and aerospace engineering at the Jacobs School of Engineering here at UC San Diego. Michael holds a BA in Japanese studies, so he's bona fide on our Japan Zoomina from Case Western University, where he also earned a BS in mathematics and physics. He then moved on to earn an MS in technology and policy from MIT and a PhD in engineering systems at MIT. He spent some time as a postdoc at Harvard and joined our faculty recently. He has a very cool website on his Davidson lab at mdavidson.org. And he's a member of JFIT and also of our China Center 21st Century 21st CC, I guess we call it. So welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining me and us.
Thanks for having me.
So here's what we're going to do, gentlemen. I propose that we start, that each of you give us some initial thoughts. And I would like to, before we open up a conversation, and then audience, please type in your questions into the Q&A so that I can build them into our conversations today. So I propose, Michael, that we start with you, because you're going to talk about how China and Japan and South Korea agreed on not financing overseas coal. That in and of itself is a remarkable sentence, given that they had provided $73 billion of such financing over the past decade. So we'll start with you for the Asia overall view, and then ask Sakamoto-san to zoom in on the Japan perspective, if that's okay. So Michael, why don't you take the microphone and kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Ulrika. And it's really nice to chat with you all. I've been watching the Zoominars for quite some time, and I'm really happy to have a conversation. So I'm going to be discussing some joint work today with Xue Gao at University of Miami, Josh Busby at UT Austin, Christine Shearer at Global Energy Monitor, and Josh Eisenman at Notre Dame. So we have a very distinguished crew of China and foreign policy experts that have been thinking about this issue of overseas coal finance. So just as some background, coal projects, some of which can be multi-billion-dollar deals in developing countries, typically have or need some foreign participation, in many cases for finance, for technology, or for construction. And so the Europeans, the United States had some early activity in this area, supported by public financing, as well as multilateral development banks, MDBs. But then Asian countries, first Japan, then South Korea, then China, really started building up overseas coal pipelines. And this was capitalizing on their strong domestic manufacturing and EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction firms that were now going overseas. So if we just look at the window from 2010 up to 2020, we're talking about $73 billion worth of coal projects that received public support from these countries. Now, it's key here, that number does not include the private support. So private banks oftentimes will co-finance or get in on these coal projects, but public finance in terms of export credits as well as insurance guarantees really help to enable this sector to grow in a lot of developing contexts. So really what we were interested in exploring are two questions. One is, why were these the last three public financiers of overseas coal? And then two, they all exited coal in 2021, each of the countries in succession committing to no longer support new overseas coal projects. So why did they all exit together roughly in the same window? And so I'm going to talk about a few market changes as well as policy changes. So on the market side, starting around 2020, and this was accelerated by the pandemic, but was not solely due to the pandemic, you started to see a lot of coal projects in some of these developing countries diminish. So we have a paper in Global Environmental Politics where we examined Indonesia and Vietnam, which are the two largest coal builders outside of China and India. And there you saw a lot of domestic changes. So fuel switching from coal to gas, or public opposition to certain coal projects, and then general changes in national planning and demand adjustments. So over rosy demand projections not coming through. Then you start to see some policy announcements from each of these three countries. So Japan, starting in mid 2020, put in place a more restrictive overseas coal policy. Then you started to see several private banks in Japan in succession make policies to no longer support new coal. And then Japan signed on to the G7 statement in May this year that said by the end of this year, no new coal projects would be funded overseas. South Korea, starting really with the election, the general election in April 2020, which was a landslide victory for the Moon administration, started to engage and more aggressively pursue overseas coal phase out. So the new legislature in the second half of 2020 was engaged in a lot of new legislation, as well as really focusing in on those firms that were engaging overseas activity, a lot of which were state-owned. And then South Korea formally announced that they would exit new overseas coal finance at the President Biden's Climate Leaders Summit in April of this year. So that brings us to China. China in 2021 has had no new reported coal projects announced. So it was already starting to feel this market shift, but it did at the same time resist some of the pressure and entreaties from the Biden administration to formally leave coal at, for example, the Biden summit. And you saw even as recently as April of this year, the head of the climate change department of the Ministry of Ecology and Environment saying that China is going to continue to fund coal overseas because that's what developing countries want. So it largely dismissed the G7 statement, but then in a very surprising turn at the UN General Assembly September this year, Xi Jinping announced that China would no longer support overseas coal. So those three countries collectively together then all agreeing to the G20 statement in October, just before the climate conference, all agreed, signed on to a statement to stop overseas coal finance. So they're all out. So, but it's important to take a step back and think about what might have contributed to this phase out, which might have lessons for other ongoing campaigns, for example, around natural gas, and also just really interesting to understand what were the dynamics that shaped this. And we have identified maybe three rough dynamics that could have influenced this phase out. One is the salience of coal export incumbent industries. So how important were international projects in the firm's business, in particular international coal projects in these firms' businesses? What were the political strength of these exporting firms? Are they large state-owned enterprises that have a very important national significance, like Doosan Heavy? How important were these exporting projects to the bilateral relationships between Japan, Korea, and China and the host countries? Another key factor that we were looking at was around internationalization. So bigger states, smaller states, some are going to be more receptive to international pressure, some are going to be less receptive to international pressure. And then how internationalized was the financial sector, which is contributing or enabling a lot of this new activity to take place. And then thirdly, thinking about the openness of domestic political institutions to encourage or discourage voices for phase out in the domestic argument. So the kind of general argument that we see is you saw some shrinking of domestic host country demand and the policy support. That's decreasing the attractiveness, the salience of these incumbent coal exporters in each of these three countries. And this is a secular trend happening across the board globally. China has slightly more competitive coal export industry, so it's kind of feeling it a little bit later. And then secondly, as these coal export incumbent industries kind of have less salience, that gives more space for international and in some case domestic pressure campaigns to cause these countries to make policy changes that no longer support coal. So, we hypothesize in the absence of this pressure, there would just be sort of a natural market exit rather than requiring a formal policy change. And just as an example, the US stopped supporting coal projects overseas long before it had a formal policy that phased it out. And then the third is really thinking about how those international pressure is then translated into a domestic context. So certainly Japan and Korea are more receptive to international pressure from the United States than China is due to their geopolitical positions. And that we hypothesize that could influence some of the timing of these policy changes. So some final thoughts here on incumbency. Certainly in all three countries, you saw really strong overseas coal incumbents. Korea had Doosan Heavy, which was a very important player in overseas coal projects. And really, South Korea only exited this industry, this sector overseas, after it signaled that Doosan Heavy, first of all, it bailed it out in early 2020 again, but also signaling that there'd be a lifeline domestically for Doosan Heavy with local domestic wind. Japan has been scaling back some of its domestic coal plants as well. And then China has three main manufacturers, and they still have some domestic market. China has not committed to no longer build any additional domestic coal plants. In the worst case, you could see even 100 more gigawatts of coal coming online, but they're increasingly diversified. And the other players also have some additional domestic opportunities. So a few more thoughts on the international finance, the nationalization of finance. Following the Asian financial crisis, Japan and South Korea started to see more cross-capitalization and foreign shareholders in their banks. You do not see this kind of activity in China. Thus, Japan and South Korea have been more receptive to shareholder pressure, which has been a key avenue for these international pressure campaigns to exit coal overseas. And then I guess the last note I'll say here is just along the lines of international pressure receptivity. South Korea being the smallest of the countries that also hosts a Green Climate Fund, you'd expect to be feel more of the pressure for these campaigns to make policy changes. Even former Vice President Al Gore wrote a very public letter calling on Korea to exit coal. Then next in line, you'd expect Japan to be receptive to international pressure. And then China, because it's a very large country, it is going to be less receptive to these pressures. And then also, it's not particularly geopolitically aligned with the major sources of international pressure, United States and the European Union. So as we look at this arc of coal finance and these changes in these three countries, we see that there is some differentiation. So, just based on this rough theory, we'd expect to see China exit slightly later than the other two countries, but also they're broadly following these market demand changes where host countries are requiring or expecting to build much less coal going forward. So I'll pause there and I look forward to Sakamoto-san's comments.
Well, thank you. That's terrific, Michael. If I could ask one quick question of clarification before we turn to Sakamoto-san, which is, who's doing the financing? So you've been talking about the heavy industry players, but the banks are in this as well, right?
Yeah, so the public financiers, which was the $73 billion number, those are publicly owned banks, export credit agencies, et cetera. And so in Japan, you're talking about JBIC and JICA, and Korea Exim, and then in China, you have China Exim, and then other public financiers. Yeah.
But the private players would also be involved in the project finance for these things, one assumes.
Yeah, so the private, it's a little bit harder to pin down the scale of the private finance. Some folks have been trying to do that. I think it's fair to say public finance has really enabled a lot of these projects to go forward. And so by buying down the risk, and particularly with insurance guarantees, which help in the case of any default in those host country governments, as well as setting up other offices to help facilitate the project. So I think it's a new area of research to look at how significant are the private banks exposed to this, and are they also going to continue or pick up the tab from the public institutions that are now exiting? I think that's a little unclear at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interjection here. So let's turn the microphone over to Sakamoto-san to hear a little bit more about Japan's position on these matters.
Thank you, Ulrike, and thank you, Michael. Really appreciate Michael's presentation, quite excellent one, covering political perspective as well as business perspectives regarding international finance support for coal power generation. In the beginning, as initial presentation, I will make probably 3 points. The first is what happened since last year in Japan on the policy development on this particular issue. As Michael pointed out, Japan introduced a very stringent 4 conditions in order for us to support financially overseas coal power generation development. That 4 conditions include efficiency needs to be higher than 43%, and the host country needs to commit to strong climate policy. There must be a request from host country to Japan, etc., etc. I think at that time, nobody in Japan expected what would happen this year. At that time, last year, when we introduced these stringent 4 conditions, many people in Japan argued that if Japan stops financial support for coal power generation in Asia, China will fill the gap. As a result, less efficient coal power generation will be introduced to Asian countries, which is not good for mitigating climate change. That was the argument last year. Then everything changed with when Biden administration took into office. We of course expected that the G7 presidency, UK, as well as COP26 presidency, UK, will put forward some proposal for coal. But with Biden administration taking office in January, there was a strong pressure from US as well, as Michael pointed out. So we joined the consensus of G7 in May to put absolute end to new direct government support for unabated coal power generation by the end of this year. Since then, there was some discussions, what means unabated coal power? In other words, what is abated coal power? I understand, to my best knowledge, international understanding on abated coal power is coal power generation with CCUS. But at this moment, there is no specific plans for developing countries to introduce CCS or retrofit a CCS. But I'm quite sure sometime in the future, there might be the needs, there might be specific projects for Asian countries to introduce or retrofit the CCUS. For instance, Indonesia has a clear plan to install CCUS to existing coal power generations. I want to mention the policy development in ADB, Asian Development Bank, which I was very much heavily involved in. They revised the energy policy since last year, and they published the new energy policy last month. In that new energy policy, ADB said flatly no to coal power generation, whether it is abated or unabated. And they even established a new mechanism to facilitate early retirement of coal power generation, which is called Energy Transition Mechanism. This was announced in Glasgow by the governor of ADB, Asakawa-san, and top government officials from Indonesia and the Philippines. So that's my first point. My second point is the agreement at COP26 on the domestic use of coal. As you know, the COP26 decisions include the words, they will accelerate efforts towards a phase down rather than phase out of unabated coal power. And also, in the margin of COP26, there was a statement issued called Global Call to Clean Power Transition, which around 50 countries signed up, including Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, and Poland, such a heavy user of coal. They put forward 4 bullet points, and one include the transition away from unabated coal power generation in 2030s for major economies and the 2040s globally. I think that the US, Japan, China didn't sign up this statement, but as I said, the Asian countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam joined this statement. This is quite significant development, which could affect the needs for financial support for coal power generation in Asia. And thirdly, I would like to talk about Japan's policy from now on. How will Japan's financial support for Asia's energy sector will change after COP26? In this regard, I would like to mention the statement made by our Prime Minister Kishida at COP26 in Glasgow. he said in his statement that Asia will be introducing more and more renewable energies, but renewable energies are intermittent and they are not a stable power source. For that reason, they would need to continue existing thermal power plant to complement power generation by renewables. And he also said Japan announced the Asia Energy Transition Initiative this June. And through that initiative, Japan would facilitate converting existing fossil fuel power generation into zero emission power sources using ammonia and hydrogen. And to that end, Japan will implement advanced project by using $100 million. He also committed Japan provide additional $10 billion support for over the next 5 years in order for Asia to decarbonize its economy. So this is part of the commitment to achieve $100 billion of financial assistance, which was made by developed countries in COP. So $10 billion additional financial support over the next 5 years for decarbonizing Asia's economy. So with that, I would like to conclude my initial presentation and take any question from Ulrike, Michael, or other audiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Terrific. So there's a lot to digest here, and I'm trying to catch up with your audience. Please feel free to type in your questions into the Q&A, and because this is recorded, I will refer to you only by your first name. So please don't take that personally. It's for your privacy protection. So the questions are coming in, and how much does this matter, and how will this change, and what are the takeaways? So let me start with the COP question, right? So there is this language in the COP26 agreement on coal phase down, and so what does it? You mentioned it, Sakamoto-san, but maybe Michael, for you, what does this mean for climate policy in China, South Korea, and Japan, from your vantage point?
Yes, if folks read anything about the final hours of the COP26, you'll know that there was this 11th hour change to the document, which originally called for a coal phase out, and now it calls for a coal phase down. And that aligns with China's language in the US-China declaration, and also with India's position on that. I think that language change is a relatively minor impact, but it certainly was very symbolic for a lot of the other parties that were hoping, including the COP26 president, that was hoping to consign coal power to history, as he said in the lead up to COP26. So COP26 did not consign coal to history, but it did make some significant changes. And I think probably more important than the statement, it's the negotiated text itself, were all of the agreements, such as Sakamoto mentioned, around the coal power to clean, as well as the commitments on the part of China to peak coal use by 2025 and to phase down by 2030 and to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. I think there are still some significant gaps in the near term, and so the countries have agreed to come back next year with hopefully enhanced commitments, really focusing on the next decade to 2030, because we've seen a lot of these long-term net zero pledges, but we're arguably looking for more ambition in the near term. And I think many eyes will be on China as well, because China has had this relatively loosely worded coal peak and phase down commitment so far.
Sakamoto, any further comments on this language for Japan? Is this significant, or should we just move on? I mean, phase out, phase down. Does that make a difference?
Yeah, before talking about Japan, let me give you my impression about this debate. I was watching that debate on live through COP26 platform. I was COP negotiator at COP 9, 10, and 11, representing Japanese government. So I know how COP decisions are negotiated. I think just a single year's COP decisions, it's very difficult to change the reality. I think a Paris Agreement or Kyoto Protocol are such, a historical agreement changes the realities. But just a single year COP decision, it's very difficult to change the reality. And phase out, phase down, the phase down is very much in line with the reality in China as well as India and many other countries. The China committed the carbon neutrality by 2060, and of course they need to phase down or even phase out in the future coal power generation. So the decision is very much in line with the reality. And that is the case for Japan as well. At this moment, Japan's power mix, 32% is coming from coal power. We intend to reduce it to 19% by 2030. That is the latest decisions made by Japanese government, approved by cabinet as part of 6th Energy Basic Plan. And we have already put in place regulations, policy instrument to realize such significant decrease from 32% to 19%. We have energy efficiency law, which stipulate coal power generation efficiency needs to exceed 43% in the near future. That is a very, very high standard. So with that policy instrument, Japan will certainly reduce the percentage of power generation. And also we will be introducing ammonia, co-firing ammonia at coal power generation. The demonstration project at 1 gigawatt large-scale coal power generation is already underway. And we also introduce hydrogen co-firing as well at the gas power stations. And towards 2050, we will be introducing further hydrogen and ammonia and CCUS. So we are very much committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. At this moment, we are using coal power and we will continue to use for the foreseeable future. But the pathway to carbon neutrality is very different. It varies among countries, depending on national circumstances. European countries will dash to renewables rather than relying on coal or natural gas. But Japan's national circumstances are very different from those. So we will be taking our own path to carbon neutrality.
So Robbie has a question that is spot on at this point of the conversation. So the cynics are coming out, but Robbie is actually not cynical. He's just very market rational. He's observing that technology has already brought some major shifts, that our technology advances are such that prices for renewable energy sources are beginning to fall, whereas prices for coal is beginning to climb just now. And he's wondering whether the government is just falling behind the private sector, that the private sector is already preparing these shifts, is already making a lot of these changes, and that these policy deliberations are actually just falling behind what the private sector is already doing. Is that true or false? And what are your thoughts on that? Michael, you want to start on that?
Sure, I could give it a try. Certainly what we find is that market changes in host country in terms of demand for coal plants has shrunk considerably prior to the governments making their coal exit decisions. So that's a key precedent, but it wasn't the sole contributor to the decision by these three countries to stay in as long as they did and then to exit altogether. I think the other observation is around fossil fuel prices. So it's correct, we're seeing a fossil fuel crisis right now with coal prices and natural gas prices, both of which are effectively global markets at this point, rising substantially starting from the end of summer due to weather, resurgent demand in the pandemic, as well as some supply bottlenecks transporting gas from Russia, for example, and coal from Australia to China. Those are relatively recent changes that I don't think directly impacted the coal phase out decisions, phase down, all of these different initiatives that we're talking about today. But I do think that they're really important developments, and we could expect to see fossil fuel price volatility and supply insecurity arising from this fossil fuel dependence going forward. And that is a key rationale for many countries to embrace renewable energy. So with the falling costs of wind and solar and batteries, you could certainly expect countries to look towards these other options as not only emissions reducing technologies, but also rational ways of dealing with energy supply security. So I would definitely agree with that.
Sakamoto-san, do you want to respond to?
Yes,
please.
yes, let me do so. There is a lot of debate in Japan, the cost of renewables and the cost of other power sources. Many people argue that solar power, wind, the cost is cheaper than fossil fuel power generations. But we need to take a holistic views in considering the cost. It is true the cost of panel of photovoltaic is getting cheaper and cheaper. The cost of wind blade is getting cheaper and cheaper. But that is just a part of the total cost. We need to consider the total cost. As I said in the initial statement, the renewables are very intermittent and variable, which means we need backup. Backup by, for example, battery, or backup by thermal power plant, which stands by in case abrupt disruption of power generation of renewables. Such total cost needs to be taken into account. And some economic research work has been implemented, including by those by my institute, IEEJ, which suggests if you consider such total cost, renewable cost is not necessarily cheaper than the fossil fuels. So again, we need to take a holistic views when discussing the cost.
So there's there are other doubters out there. So so Rick is wondering how much. So this is an initial reaction to Michael, what your research on the financing. How much difference this will really make at the end of the day to global use of coal and emissions, the fact that financing is going away. And Daniel is wondering whether this is all nice and well, and we have all of these agreements, we phase down, but the heavy users, and he's in particular thinking of India and China, may face energy shortages if they actually abide. And then are you expecting any backsliding there, or is this really a moment of great hope and a brighter future?
Yeah, those are all really good questions. I think part of this dovetails with Sakamoto-san's opinion there on renewable energy and the cost and balancing. And so I guess I will encourage or begin a slight disagreement or maybe a different opinion on the matter, that at low penetrations of renewable energy, we see very little so-called integration costs. So the costs that you need to give to other power generators to remain on standby, to ramp, to be available when the wind or the sun goes away. At very low penetrations is exactly where all of these countries are that we're talking about, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others, very small penetrations of intermittent renewables so far. And if you scale that up, you start to see some issues, maybe around 30% penetration. California, certainly we have some difficulties with managing our solar variability challenge because we're a very long and vertical state. So the sun sets and rises basically at the same time everywhere over the state. But as you build more transmission network, Japan obviously has some similar geographic challenges. As you spread out the grid, you get to manage that variability a little bit more. Then what you're really talking about is if you try to go to 50%, 60%, 80% intermittent renewables, then yeah, you're talking about some serious costs. You're going to have to deal with some very expensive long-term energy storage. You have to have backups and all of that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to distinguish between the problems that countries are facing right now in scaling up wind and solar, which are not really grid cost related. They're more regulation, markets, and incumbency related. So you'll see grid operators in Vietnam and Indonesia saying we can't handle intermittency of renewables. What really they're saying is we don't want to give up our incumbent plants, and most of the renewables are independent power producers, and of course we don't want them to succeed. It's a similar situation in India. So I think it's important to distinguish that. But yes, as we're planning for carbon neutrality, when we need to get to 60%, maybe 80% intermittent renewables in places, then yeah, we need to think very carefully about how we're going to manage that cost. And the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, is not the only thing that matters. So that's all to say that I think these host countries, Vietnam and Indonesia, for example, and others, are finally coming around to this notion that coal is not the only way to provide electricity right now. There are other ways to do it. Solar is cheaper right now at these low penetrations. Gas is an option for some of these places. And I think as you dry up finance for coal, and as these countries simultaneously decide that we don't need more of it, then you're going to see a lot fewer coal projects being built, which is very good for the climate, because we know that we need to phase down coal dramatically to reach carbon neutrality goals. So I think that's kind of my thoughts on the significance of the coal phase down. Was there a second question on China?
Yeah, the backsliding. That's all is not nice and well while we're in Scotland, but then we go home and there's an energy shortage, and we turn everything back on in the old way.
The power shortage is a really interesting example, and I actually have an article, Foreign Affairs Online, coming out later this week on this topic. And the kind of the fundamental crux of it is that power shortages were due to a variety of institutional factors related to China's market structure, which is very problematic. And you saw some simultaneous coal mining supply shortages, not coal power capacity shortages, but coal mining supply issues that were coming. So China relaxed some of the restrictions, the coal mining has been resolved, and the power shortages have essentially been ended for now. I do think it's an important long-term question of if countries look at this and say, okay, well, if we can see these kinds of insecurities in fossil fuel, we can dig up the ground and hold on to it. What would we expect when we have wind and solar if we went for days or weeks without strong wind or sun? So I do think that there is a potential for that to happen, but I think that also this is a short-term fix, and we need to put the kind of short-term measures that were put in place to deal with the power shortage in context and really focus on where the longer-term directions are.
Sakamoto-san, you want to join on those questions? Do you have any additional footnotes or? Yeah, just to make additional comment. I can't agree with Michael more in his point that the higher the percentage of penetration of renewables, the more serious the issue will be for the backup cost for renewables. That is true. In Japan's case, in 2030, we expect the renewable percentage will go up nearly 40%. At that percentage, I think we will face serious issues of additional costs to back up intermittent renewables. That's one point. The other point is the backsliding due to power shortage. I just want to point out that that is happening in the UK now. Because of the power shortage in UK, they are now resuming the operations of old coal power generation, which had been suspended. So the energy supply, energy security is the utmost importance for our daily life. We cannot live without electricity. That is even more and more the case with electrification will go on toward carbon neutrality.
Well, of course, Germany would also be a case study in this, right? So Robbie, by the way, had a footnote on all of this and reminds us that when we talk about total cost of these various energy options, it might be wise of us to include the cost of pollution and climate, right? Because this is what we're actually here to talk about. We're talking about climate. And that's why we don't like coal, because if we were to figure in the pollution cost of coal, then it would be much more expensive than any of these other things, except that this goes back to Ronald Coase and all kinds of, theories that that cost is born at a different place than, so that was very, very complicated calculations there. But that leads me to the role of government. And we have a number of questions here. And I think, Sakamoto-san, let's start with you on this. James and Akira and others have asked about Japan's promises. So Prime Minister Kishida has, I'll say, reiterated the 2030 goal, and then there's the reduce coal, and there are these guidelines now. So Akira wants to know what the consequences would be for Japan's government if the goals are not met. And James wonders, and there's actually others as well, I wonder whether the only way to really meet these goals is to turn the nuclear power plants back on, and what the situation is about that.
All I can say is that the Japanese government and the private sectors will make utmost effort to meet the target, which is a 46% GHG reductions compared with 2013. It is certainly very, very difficult. And the carbon neutrality by 2050 is even more challenging. But I think all stakeholders in both the public and the private are very much committed to it. And there would be some business opportunities in achieving that process, in achieving that target. The nuclear, this is a very difficult political question in Japan, as you know. You can easily imagine this is affected by Fukushima's nuclear accident in 2011. As I said last month, the Japanese government and the cabinet approved the 6th energy basic plan. In that revised plan, the nuclear, it took rather ambiguous positions. Nuclear is important, nuclear will play an important role, while there is no reference to new constructions or renewed constructions of nuclear power plant, which is a very political issue. But we, in the near future, probably the next revised basic energy policy, we need to revisit the issue of nuclear. In my personal views, nuclear is essential to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. The carbon neutrality needs to be maintained. The existing nuclear power plant will be decommissioned in the future. Then it will be even more difficult for us to keep carbon neutralities. So in order to address that issue, we would need to construct a new nuclear power plant in the near future, as is the case in France.
So we're talking about money today, right? And we started out with this question about, so these 3 countries have agreed to no longer furnish these loans. And so there are savings, right? $73 billion of money that are not invested in power plants might now be available to invest in other things, right? So how much extra investment in electricity generation would Japan need to meet? If you have any idea, Toshi, that would be great. How much extra investment in electricity generation, I'm reading the question, would Japan need in order to meet the needs of electrification and CO2 reduction? Over what time frame? I mean, is this a knowable? I wonder whether it's a knowable number. I guess one could forecast this out. Michael, do you have any thoughts on this? Or Toshi, either one. It's a great question.
It's a very difficult question to answer. Um, to be quite honest with you, in the public debate on the revised energy basic plans, we discussed a lot about electricity price in the future. If we are to achieve 46% target, or if we achieve to carbon neutral by 2050, how much electricity retail price will increase? And the result is that depending on the assumption, it could double towards the future. But we didn't discuss much about the economy-wide cost, economy-wide investment cost to achieve carbon neutrality. I'm afraid that that's all I can say at this moment.
So let's go back a little bit more to the larger Asia thing. So you mentioned the UK, I mentioned Germany, and one of the problems in Europe right now is that it's a fairly small place with a lot of countries, and so one country exiting nuclear while the other is building new nuclear power plants, that doesn't move the needle. And the same in coal. But Michael, so can you talk a little bit more about China here, because it's clearly important. So why was China the last holdout to commit to this overseas coal financing, and what's going on in the domestic climate policy situation there, and how does that affect Japan?
Yeah, it's a big question. So I think the same basic logic plays out that I described for all three countries as it does in China. So demand for these overseas coal projects started to dry up. China was slightly later than the other two because it was coming in more competitive. It was building ultra supercritical plants, at or nearby the same efficiency the Japanese equipment providers were doing. And so they weren't really, the Japanese and the South Koreans couldn't really compete with China. So China was scooping up all the projects. And then, of course, the Chinese lenders had a lot of money to throw at this problem, in most cases at commercial rates, not even at concessional rates, but they, because they were financing these Chinese equipment providers and EPC to go abroad, they were getting some Chinese money. So market started to dry up, and then the policy change. And I think there is a real difference between the pressure that China feels versus the pressure that Japan or South Korea feels on this in this matter. I tend to think that South Korea is more receptive to international pressure than Japan is, due to its size and its position in these areas, and China is the least. So we would expect to see China kind of hold out a little bit longer. But it was very much a surprise in September for many of us for Xi Jinping to announce the exit. I thought it would take in a longer time. We saw some very initial signs from, for example, ICBC, a major commercial bank in China, saying that they were going to consider putting in a phase down policy for their overseas coal finance in early summer. But really not, as I said, as late as April, the Chinese government, the head of the climate change department in the Chinese government was saying, we're going to continue financing coal. So it was quite a shocker. I think one thing to note here is that this was made by Xi Jinping at a very public international fora, the UN General Assembly. China announced its carbon neutrality commitment at the previous year's UNGA. So the China is really utilizing these international fora to make these announcements, in contrast to, for example, the US-China bilateral agreement and lead up to Paris, where they announced their first commitment to the Paris Agreement and really helped to make that thing a possibility. So China is kind of moving away and embracing more of these international fora, standing on the global stage, thinking about how their commitments can help improve their image as well as further their own geopolitical goals. So I think it was a very strategic maneuver. But ironically, because Xi Jinping announced it in September, and you had all these commitments made in the year leading up to COP, and the week before COP, China didn't really announce anything new significant. So people kept complaining that China didn't come to COP with anything new because they had already announced it a year before. So it was a little bit of a PR problem for China in that respect. But I think the updated Paris commitment does represent an enhancement over their original ambition. But I do think that next year, a lot of folks, everyone will be looking at China and saying, okay, what more can you put on? Can you put some more flesh on the bones of this 2030 commitment with respect to coal? And I don't know exactly where they're going to sit on this, because China operates in this 5-year planning period. We're in this 5-year planning period that's going to end in 2025. It's kind of difficult to completely change the entire structure of it at this point. And there are still a lot of incumbent industries in China pushing for more coal plants to be built in this next 5-year period. But the language is pretty clear that China is going to peak coal use by 2025, and that's coal use across the board. About half of China's coal is used outside of power generation. So I think there's some encouraging signs, but I'm not quite sure what we can expect from China at the next COP.
And Sakamoto-san, to what extent does all of that affect policy making in Japan? So, I mean, how should we think about this? Is this something where like your colleagues at IEEJ or in the government are sitting and studying China very carefully to determine what they're going to do next, or is this completely independent and not so important for Japan?
Of course, it's not completely independent or completely separate. China is a big neighbor, the second largest economies, and the Japanese business people are competing with Chinese counterparts in Asia's market. That's the reality of business, as you know. And we need to support Japanese businesses in overseas operations. So, of course, China's positions, China's policy would affect business behavior as well as policy making in Japan. But at the same time, we need to look at Asia. We need to look at the developing countries. We need to look at the realities of those host countries. The reality is they continue to rely upon fossil fuels, in particular gas. They need to switch coal to gas. And also they need to decarbonize a thermal power plant. So that's a background of Prime Minister Kishida's statement at COP26 at Glasgow. As I mentioned earlier, he announced the support, additional financial support, $10 billion US dollars for over the next 5 years to help decarbonize Asia or developing countries. And also, he also mentioned the need to decarbonize to make zero emissions for Asia's thermal power plant by using ammonia and hydrogen. And the hydrogen and ammonia, we have, I think the Japanese business have a technological advantage over Chinese counterpart. So for that perspective, Japan can contribute to Asia's carbon neutrality.
All right, I could go on for hours. It's time for my last question. And as the regulars on the Japan Zoomina know, I always like to ask Professor Hugh Patrick's last question, which great question as my last question, which is, what are you worried about most? And I'll let you decide what area, whether you want to worry about the climate or coal or politics. So Sakamoto-san, you want to go first? What are you worried about most?
At this moment, I'm worried about what would happen next year. In particular, German's presidency of G7. As you know, in new German administration, the Green Party will be taking the lead of environment and energy policies. And Germany will be the G7 presidency next year. And in COP26 at Glasgow, there was another statement issued by like-minded countries, include G7 countries, except for Japan. That statement said they will finish international financial support for fossil fuel energy sector. Not only coal, but also other fossil fuels. Those are signed up by G7 countries except for Japan. So my worry is that Germany will be pushing forward to new proposal to put end for fossil fuel international financial support. But I firmly believe that is not good for Asian countries. As I said, they need to continue to rely upon fossil fuels, in particular natural gas. in the revised energy policy of ADB, there was a lot of requests, a lot of strong voices from Asian countries that Asian ADB needs to continue support natural gas. So that's the reality.
Wow. That's next year, we'll know. And so that's super interesting. So then that's bad for all of Asia, is what you say. It's too soon, too much, too. Well, let me think about that. So, Michael, what's your biggest concern? What's your nightmare?
Yeah, well, I have many, as anyone who works on climate change does. But I think particularly this year, and to some extent, my worries have softened a little bit. But this year, I was quite worried that this power shortage situation that's become a global energy crisis would cause countries to start to backslide on their climate commitments. Again, the crisis did not originate in renewable energy intermittency or these other issues. It was largely governed by these fossil fuel dynamics, though in some cases, some renewable energy variability may have helped exacerbate it, but largely originating in the global fossil fuel markets. Nevertheless, when folks think of secure energy, they usually don't think of solar and wind. And so my worry has been that countries are going to either you'll see fossil incumbents utilize this to their advantage and say, okay, look, you can't rely on renewables because energy security is so important. Look what happens when we have just a small amount of power shortages. And look how it affects the global economy. And then they'll push to embrace more of these fossil fuel measures in countries where we don't really need to build out more coal and gas infrastructure. So I think that's really driving home. And then if you look at these countries, developing countries that are still facing difficult load shedding, inability to meet growing industrial and consumer demand, that they're going to look at these alternatives and say, okay, but this could be so much worse if we have no control over the fuel supply from wind and solar. So I think that's my biggest worry, is that countries are going to see this power shortage and use it as a reason or excuse to backslide on climate commitments.
Wow. Yeah, so that is indeed, of course, the continuing worry. And it also explains in a way the German position to just say, no, right? The buck stops here. But yeah, as I said, I could go on forever, but we can't. Time is up. Thank you, audience, for staying with us until the very end, and join us in 2 weeks from now with Dr. Yuko Harayama to talk about women in Japanese science, business, and politics. And thank you very much, Toshiyuki Sakamoto from IEEJ and Michael Davidson from the University of California, San Diego. This was terrific. I learned a lot. I could keep going, but we'll have to do that at another time. Thank you. And until we meet again, please all stay well and stay safe.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.